How can we love others without losing ourselves? That's the topic we're going to be addressing today on Flourish-Meant. I'm your host, Tina Yeager. Today, I have an expert guest with a personal testimony on this topic. Her name is Sonja Meyrer, and she has been helping people navigate difficult relationships and situations where they feel stuck, because in 2019, she lost her husband of almost 30 years to suicide after a long battle with mental illness and addiction. And at God's prompting, she chose to dedicate her life to helping others discern how to help, love, and care for someone who's struggling without losing themselves in the process. Welcome to Flourish-Meant, Sonya. I am so honored to have you here, and I can't wait to talk about this conversation. It's so important.
Thank you. I'm grateful to be here. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm grateful to be in a position where I can come and I can share. I'm encouraged that there are people out there who might need to hear what we're going to talk about today.
So to begin with, let's talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about that journey of how you learned the hard way how to navigate helping someone who is really struggling and in a state of crisis without losing yourself, and the point at which when you felt called to begin to help others who are struggling in this situation.
Yeah. I always say to clients and to friends, when we start down this journey of wanting to help and take over someone's life, it doesn't usually happen with that person. It probably started a long time ago. So I would say that in my upbringing, I learned to be a caretaker, to make sure that I was helping and taking care of the adults in my life who weren't always so good at taking care of themselves. So this pattern of enabling or sort of being dependent on other people started very early. When I got married, I didn't know anything about addiction. It really wasn't in my family at all. And so it was very surprising to me as those last 10 years of marriage, the addiction showed up. I had no idea what to do. In the book, I mentioned that we had a fairly normal life when it came to alcohol. We didn't drink a lot, maybe here or there. He was from Germany, so drinking beer is sort of part of the culture. And it was a very normal marriage, I would say, up until then. And then it wasn't anymore. And when you're standing by watching someone's behavior start to change and their coping patterns start to change, it's a very scary thing. Most of us don't come equipped to know how to help and support someone when they're starting to careen out of control. So I became very interested in asking the question, what should I do? And I was encouraged by my pastor and also by therapists to start attending recovery programs for myself, because along the way, somehow what had happened is I became this expert at letting my partner know, this is what you need to do, and this is where you're failing. But I started to lose sight of who I was. And I started to behave in ways that weren't congruent with what I would consider to be my Christian calling either. So being a constant nag and criticizing and shaming, it might feel like it's justified, but it's really not okay. So I recognized that I needed some help as well.
So for someone who's in this situation, how do they recognize whether they are setting boundaries or whether they are actually doing what you are describing, where they're being that unhealthy, unhelpful person in that crisis person's life?
Yeah, it always starts with recognizing our own behaviors. And there's a tension because we are called, especially as Christ followers, to be loving and caring and compassionate. So we don't get to do away with that. But when we get pulled in the opposite direction, where we feel like our loving and helping is going to fix or change someone or make them do something, that's when we get into some unhealthy patterns. So it doesn't usually start with the other person, it starts with us. Am I telling someone constantly what to do? Believe it or not, people don't always want to hear what you have to say. So am I giving advice to people who aren't interested in my advice? Am I keeping tabs on someone, following them because I have suspicions? Am I compromising my values? And that happens as Christ followers, especially when we slowly start to let our values erode because of somebody else's illness or mental illness. So there are a whole host of different signs where we might say, I think my behavior is not in line with what is godly. And when we recognize that, that's when we can start to think about doing the work of becoming ourselves again. And the way I like to describe it is, in a healthy relationship, you are one person, and the other person is uniquely themselves. And we come together because we enjoy each other's company, we support each other, we care for each other, we drive each other spiritually. In an unhealthy relationships, we kind of become covered by someone else. And on the cover of the book, if I may just hold it up real quick, there's sort of a picture of all of these trees that are shrouding out this other tree, if you will. And this little one that wants to grow is just becoming completely covered by someone else. And I think that's what happens when we get into these unhealthy patterns of relationships.
What are some signs that you noticed when you were starting to go missing, so to speak, where you were starting to lose yourself? What were the things that you were feeling in your body and in your emotions that kind of keyed you in something isn't right?
In the book, I describe the point of insanity when and I know that this is not uncommon. I was in the garage, literally weeding through the recycling bin to count the number of beer bottles. And that sounds a little disgusting, but when you get to the point where you feel like you're losing your sanity a little bit, the thing that's true is now being refuted by the person you love and trust. There's a moment where you feel like, I think I need a little more evidence here. And, when I was, and this had been years into the addiction, when I really felt like I need to start counting. And I was describing, it was hot, it was humid, it was sticky. My hair was in the recycling bin, and I was taking pictures. And at some point I stood up and I said, why am I doing this? This is really insanity, because I knew that I didn't need any more evidence. I knew that there was something wrong, and the person I was doing life with wasn't able to see it. And one of the trademark qualities of someone who struggles with the disease of addiction is the inability to see the truth or tell the truth. So at some point, I had to get myself healthy again. Other kinds of negotiations that would happen. Well, if you only drink this, then I'll only drink this, or I've been doing really well so far, or I'll go to AA, and then after 2 times they don't go anymore. So this constant monitoring. How are you doing? How was your meeting? Did you learn anything? What happens is that you just lose sight of who you are. I had gifts and talents. I wanted to be flourishing. I didn't want to spend every night worrying, is he going to come to bed drunk or not drunk? I wanted to live my life. And that becomes impossible when we're so overwhelmed and obsessed with trying to help or fix someone else.
So you were getting sucked into the addict's kind of quicksand of
Right.
denial with them.
Right. And that's sort of the classic terminology of what we call codependency. And codependency, it's been thrown around there quite a bit, and people use it in some ways that are probably not always accurate. Codependency is, for me, the visual is there's someone on a roller coaster ride. In this sense, it was addiction. And I've strapped myself in next to them, and I'm along for the ride with them. And what I have to learn is how to unstrap myself and get out. And so, this idea that when someone struggles with addiction, we say in recovery circles, we get some on us. It's almost impossible to watch someone deteriorate and know at the beginning what we can do about it. But there's a lot we can do, including setting boundaries to regain our sanity, if you will.
So how do you stay, and to go back to my metaphor of the quicksand, how do you stay outside of the quicksand pit and be an anchor and stay healthy yourself without getting pulled into the quicksand with the person who has a mental illness or who is in crisis or who has an addiction? What are some things that you can put into place to stay healthy and anchor yourself?
Yeah, I believe it starts with 2 assumptions. Number one is that I matter. And, as a Christ follower, if I don't believe that, it makes the work of setting boundaries really difficult, because that person is really wanting us to jump in the quicksand with them, not because they're a bad person, but because they're struggling and it's better for them to have you in there. So if I believe that my life matters, that's a really good starting point. The other, I think, biblical principle is that everyone is responsible for themselves. At the end of the day, it is not my job to assume the capacity for someone else's life or the responsibility. And I think that's a biblical principle too, despite the fact that we are to be loving and kind. One of the things we confuse often is what it actually means to be loving and kind. And I had a client this morning, a Christian woman who was just talking about how hard it was to set boundaries because it made her feel like she was being mean or she was being selfish. Sometimes setting a boundary in love is the most loving thing you can do for someone, even if they don't like it. So those are kind of two anchors that I would say start this process. And then we start to examine ourselves and our own behavior, because it is impossible to set boundaries well if we don't know why we're doing it. And that's kind of the premise for the book. I got very frustrated with people who would encourage boundary setting. You need to go and just tell him no, or you need to go and just kick him to the curb, whatever, but never thought about the fact that someone may not be equipped. And so when you encourage someone to set a strong boundary and they go do that and they're greeted with this wave of pushback, that can be more damaging than to help them and equip them. So I always say we start with introspection. What is it that I care about? What do I value? Where are my expectations not being met by this person? And a lot of times with alcohol, it's not about the drinking, it's about the behavior. When you drink, when you choose to not get help for your addiction, I don't know who's showing up at the door, so that's scary. I don't have your emotional intimacy. I don't have your physical being sometimes with me. Those are deal breakers for me in a marriage. So we have to learn what are the values and the behaviors that are being stepped on. And then we implement some of the tools, acceptance, detachment, and the actual boundary setting.
That's really great. I want to dive into some more practical tips about that in the second half of our conversation. But for now, can you please share with the audience how to get a copy of your book and how to
Yes.
stay connected with you online?
Gladly. So it's called And Then You Went Missing. It is available on Amazon as well as on Barnes and Noble. And my website is sonyamcoaching.com. So SONJAM coaching.com. You can get more information about workshops, about coaching, about the book. And there are some other resources as well. In the book, there's a link at the end with questions where you can get additional resources on the webpage. So come connect with me if you want. For a 30-minute session, we can talk and I can share a little bit more about the book with you too.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sonya. And in this second half of our conversation with Sonja Meyrer, we want to talk about some practical ways that you can discern how to begin to set boundaries so you love other people, but don't lose yourself. So, Sonya, talk to us about some practical things that people can do to get started. We talked about a few of those in the first half of our conversation. I don't want to repeat that, but let's move into some more things that we can unpack about knowing the difference between loving and kindness and that codependency word enabling and crippling that other person, and then the other fallout piece, which is losing yourself in that process.
Yeah. So in order for us to set boundaries, and boundaries are really just an indication of where my life ends and your life begins. So we know a lot about boundaries in the physical world. There are fences and there are frames around our houses. So we know where there are boundaries there, but sometimes we get confused about our relational boundaries, but we have them. We are responsible for ourselves and we are responsible for who we're in relationship and how we behave. So it starts with an ownership issue. If I'm going to set a boundary with someone, I need to let them know. But there's a difference between a boundary and a request. So I always use the example with my clients, and we laugh about this in the workshop. Let's say you have a neighbor who likes to walk their dog, tiny little dog likes to walk them by your beautiful yard and allows the dog to do his business in your yard and continues to go on. What do? Well, you make a request first, right? A normal person wouldn't call the police immediately. A normal person would go and say, hey, excuse me, but this is what's going on. And you make a request for change. I would like to ask you to pick up after your dog. That would be great. But then it happens again and it happens again. And so that's when we start to have to employ some boundaries. And the difference between a request and a boundary is simply that a boundary says, this is not acceptable to me. And here's what I'm going to do to protect my values. So it's not a threat. People often say, I don't want to set a boundary because it sounds like it's an ultimatum. Well, it's not an ultimatum. A boundary is something you do to protect something you value. And it really works 100% of the time if you set it properly. So if I go back to that person and I say, look, appreciate that your dog is little, but we had this conversation and it's not okay with me that you allow your dog to go in my front yard. I have asked for change. It hasn't happened. So if it happens again, I'm going to call the homeowners association, or I'm going to report to the police, or I'm going to pick it up and put it in your yard, whatever your consequence is. A boundary without a consequence is just a request. And so we have to start to think about what are some natural consequences that we might employ in order to protect a boundary. So one of the things that I always say is do not ever set a boundary when you're in an emotional state of mind. A boundary is something you think about. In one of the workshops that I host, we actually have a whole bunch of steps that we take before we ever have a boundary conversation. So things like talk to someone else about it, talk it out, not in a gossipy way, but converse with someone you trust and say, hey, this person has really been stepping on my values here, and I'm thinking about having a conversation. Can I process this with you? And then you think about your own heart, because likely you've been allowing something. Now, in a situation of addiction, you might start by saying, I have allowed this alcoholism to be a part of our home for several years, and that's on me, because we have some ownership in the way that we've behaved. Then we are very, very clear with them about our boundary. It is not acceptable to me to live in an alcoholic marriage, for example. And then we talk about our consequence. And so what I'm asking for, here's just an example, is for you to commit to a serious recovery program and to do what it is that the experts are asking you to do. If your answer is no, which is your right, the person on the other side doesn't have to do what we say, but then we have the opportunity to say, and if that's not something you're willing to do, then I'm going to continue to set boundaries to protect myself. So this is a whole process as we learn to set boundaries with the people that we love who are struggling.
So you're saying that boundaries, it comes in stages. You don't set up all the boundaries all up front and overwhelm the person that's in a mental health crisis or dealing with an addiction all at once.
Right. And I think that's really important. And I'm glad you said that, because this idea that we should kick someone to the curb or set them out, that's not very kind. And it doesn't speak very highly of your ability to set those primary boundaries. So I hear a lot from parents who have kids who are still living at home, and this idea that they never help. And there's a lot of complaining. Well, what was the agreement? What was the agreement when they came in? And if they aren't meeting that agreement, then you go back and you can renegotiate, but you've got to be consequent about those smaller boundaries. If you're not willing to help in the kitchen and do the dishes, then you will not be allowed in the kitchen anymore. If you are not paying rent, then you'll get 2 weeks notice and you'll have to move out. But it doesn't have to be this one time, explosion of emotion, and then we set a boundary. That's not really fair. And that's actually not very helpful either.
Right. And then people usually wait too long. I don't know if you find this to be true, before they do anything about a situation. And they are reacting out of this overwhelm and this pushback. They've been pushed aside and gotten lost for so long that their reaction is setting that boundary with pitchforks and torches instead
Right.
of with a request. So they're so angry and so overwhelmed that they get way too forceful and dump way too much into that initial conversation.
And that's why some of these recovery communities for people doing life with someone struggling are really helpful, because they'll tell you right away, don't do anything at first, unless you're really in danger. For the most part, we can do something for 24 hours. They say this in recovery, that would abhor us if we had to do it for a lifetime. So, this problem didn't happen overnight. Take a deep breath and start thinking about your own journey first. And when you're ready to set a boundary, own that part. I have allowed this to happen. One of the most difficult things with setting boundaries is not the conversation, and it's not even so much the thinking of it, it's the afterwards. So you've told this person now, especially when it comes to addiction, I'm not going to live in a relationship with you if you continue this thing that you think you need just to breathe. So yeah, they're going to have an opinion about it. And I don't think I've ever met anybody who said, thank you so much, Tina, for sharing that wisdom about my behavior. I can't wait to go change. That's usually not the way people greet our boundaries. And so we have to be prepared for what happens afterwards. And I provide my clients with a lot of different techniques to kind of endure the aftermath. One of them simply being to recognize that the other person has permission to not like your boundary. We don't have to jump in to rescue their feelings. We don't have to tell them that what they're feeling is wrong. We don't have to do any of those things. We have permission to let them be unhappy. And sometimes it's that sense of unease with someone else's unhappiness that has gotten us into this mess in the first place. Because, like you said, we probably should have been doing something earlier. So, to learn to sit in someone else's discomfort, one of the other things that can happen is we get derailed because someone who's not interested in hearing our boundaries is going to do a whole bunch of other things to try to get off topic. Well, what about you? Will you do the same thing? How can you be so mean after everything I've done? So they're going to come back with all kinds of enthusiastic messages. And we have to remember to be very single-minded. I hear what you're saying. And today I'm letting you know about a boundary that I'm setting with you. We can talk about me tomorrow. Let's set an appointment for me tomorrow. But we have to be very, very focused on the one boundary. It is not acceptable to me that this happens. And here's what I'm going to do. So I often tell them to imagine that you're a broken record. For the people who remember what a record are, the younger people wouldn't know what that is, but you just repeat the same message. I hear you, and this is what I'm communicating today. And you have permission to end the conversation. We also talk about some tips for listening with empathy without engaging. So if we're having a conversation and you're telling me how mean and horrible I am, I can use words like, wow. And I can just sit with that. I don't have to react. I don't have to get in and play tug of war with you. If I have a child who comes and says, you're the most horrible person in the world and I'm moving to Siberia, I can say, oh wow, cool, or tell me more, or not patronizing me, but I don't have to get involved in an emotional tug of war. This is my boundary. I'm setting it. I've thought it through, and I'm going to push forward with it.
And this is so much more effective to do after you've really sat in prayer with the Lord and let the Holy Spirit kind of go through the pieces that are your issues. If you don't work out what are your issues and get honest with God about that before you get into this conversation, the enemy that works through this other person who is vulnerable to that will attack you at your issues in that conversation, and you won't be able to withstand the attack. So it's very important for you to recognize these are my issues. These are the things that I'm working on, so that you can be honest about that. If that person brings that against you in the conversation, and say, yes, I recognize those are my issues. I'm working on those. And this
It
is
kind of
how I'm working on them.
Yeah, and it comes back to that very initial fundamental belief that I matter. And so often we get into these situations because we're lacking self-esteem, because there are maybe traumatic issues from the past that we need to work on. And so until we get to the point where our boundaries are worth defending, it's going to be a struggle. It'll be easy to get derailed. So the last chapter of the book is all about self-care. And self-care is really something that we really should envelop in all of our life. And it's not about the bubble bath. It can be, but it's about the things that we need to do to replenish. And some of that is, those things we do on our spiritual path. Simple things like eating and hydrating and sleeping. Those are the things we also need to do, because this is hard. This is hard work, and relationships can be very taxing. They can be beautiful, and they can also be very taxing.
What's one thing that you would leave with for someone who's in ministry, perhaps, with a truth about the difference between loving someone with healthy boundaries and losing yourself because you're trying to love, but you're really just not showing a healthy type of Christ-centered love with truth involved?
I would always start with trying to understand that being loving is not always the easy option. So you and I know this when we have toddlers, giving them everything they want is not beneficial to them. That's not loving. It may feel like something we want to do because it makes us feel good. And the same is true with the adults in our life. Caving into their requests and their demands that are unhealthy is not loving. And if you look at Jesus's life, Jesus was really good at setting boundaries. When he needed to remove himself, he did, and he didn't even explain it. And I think we need to learn that the act of love, it's not a feeling about wanting to be warm and squishy with someone, it's wanting what's best for them. And sometimes setting a healthy boundary is not only the best thing for us, but it's the best thing for the other person as well. And so that's why I think the conversation with someone to say, hey, I'm thinking that this is healthy. Would you weigh in on that? Can be really helpful as well.
This has been such a tremendous conversation. Thank you for being on the show today, Sonya.
My
How can
pleasure.
people stay connected with you and get a copy of your book?
Yes. So, and then you went missing is available on Amazon as well as on Barnes and Noble. And please reach out. My website is Sonja M Coaching, SONJAM coaching.com. You can connect with me there. You can put in your email address and I'll respond, or we can connect for a 30-minute conversation free to just find out how you might move your life forward in a healthy way.
I am so glad that you came on the show today, Sonya. And I'm glad that all of you have tuned in to listen to this amazing conversation. I hope that you were inspired to learn more about how you can set healthy boundaries and love others without losing yourself. And of course, I also hope that you hit subscribe and come back for the next episode of Flourishment.